Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker-Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process in discussions between the authors, narrators, producers, and post-production teams that bring them all together, as well as guests who have listened to the audiobooks and have questions for the creative teams. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. And today I have with me Zelly Ruskin, author of Not Yours to Keep, a domestic suspense about a 32-year-old adoption specialist. So we'll hear more about her book, her multi-voiced audiobook edition, and about Zelly herself in this episode. Zelly, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's jump right in. This is your debut novel, is that right?
Yes, it is.
All right. And I understand
never thought I'd be
here. Well, we'll hear more about that. And you're working with She Writes Press, yeah?
Yes.
That's good.
Yes.
Good. Well, tell us a little bit about your background. And I always love hearing about, where did you grow up? When did your interest in writing begin? Give us some of the backstory.
I've sort of been all over the Northeast. I grew up in New York, in north of the city. And I lived in Boston, I lived in Pennsylvania, and now I'm a reborn New Yorker again. And have absolutely no training in writing whatsoever, no experience with literature. I was a psych major. I was a social worker. And that was pretty much my career. I started writing, I guess, about 12 years ago. I was just at a transition in my life and I needed an outlet, and writing seemed to be the thing that I turned to, and was really working on this project and felt like I needed to finish a project. So I just took a risk and I applied to a writing workshop, somehow got in that writing workshop, learned everything. And 6 years later, after working on that project, I threw it away. But I needed it. It was the basis of creating a writer. And I was ready to really put down on paper this plot that I had in mind, which was not yours to keep.
Yeah. And what was it that kind of sparked that first story idea? Was there some incident or experience that you had that led to this story forming?
It's interesting. I think long before I set out to become a writer or an author, I had this moment where I was in what I call a long overdue, over expired relationship, and which is a very long story that I will probably put in a different book. But in that, I found a photograph that belonged to this person. And when I asked about it, he flat out lied. And in that moment, I didn't care about the lie. I stared at that photograph thinking, there's a cool plot in there somewhere. So all these years later, it ruminated. And when I was really ready to write, I was like, I'm going to make something out of that. And, stories come from, at least for me, a lot of the what ifs.
Right. Yeah.
So what if? What do I do with this? How do I make this intriguing? And that's when I drew from my experience as a social worker. My first job had been in adoption, and the impact of that work had stayed with me for years. And it was always something that I wanted to tell. The movies and the TV shows and the books and their version of adoption and the people in adoption wasn't right for me. And I wanted people to understand the intricacies and have some compassion for what I had learned. So what if I take this photograph and I make it a baby and I somehow put it into this world of adoption? And then there was one final personal piece that I drew on, which is after I left the field of adoption, I discovered that I had fertility issues. And so that became my greatest what if. What if I had known when I was an adoption consultant that I had fertility issues, that I might not be able to have a baby, what would have happened to my morals and ethics? And would I have crossed any lines? And so that's where this book is. That's how it got started.
It seems like that. Now, I know, like, I would feel comfortable saying nothing. I know really nothing about that adoption world, that realm that you're talking about, the being an adoption specialist. I'm like the absolute opposite of, like, I know nothing. So it seems to me, just imagining what some of the potential issues could be, that it is, it must be an area where sort of ripe for all kinds of the full range of experiences, from great joy and delight and love to just some of the most horrible things I could imagine happening to families and children. And
I mean, it was the full gamut. It was working with birth parents who had to make the most difficult choice that was going to impact the rest of their life, whether for whatever reason they made that choice, and helping them through that. And it was working with, adoptive couples and when I spoke to some adult adoptees when I was researching this, and something that really hit home with me, that we didn't have this kind of perception back then, as progressive as we were back then. If you think about it, these adoptive couples didn't come to us by first choice. Mm-hmm. I do know some people who have chosen the adoption route for parenthood no matter what. But back then, in the work that I did, nobody really came to us out of joy. But in the end, we were, at least for adoptive families, doing what we thought was the greatest thing. We were making families for a baby that needed parents in that moment. What I've learned in recent years, what we couldn't have anticipated back then was really the impact on that child. Here the laws and the agency policies and everything we were doing was we were upstanding and we were following all the guidelines, but we had no way of knowing how we had just changed lives. And so that's what really stuck with me. And that's the story that I really needed. I wanted people to get a glimpse of.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the title.
It didn't start off here. It didn't start off as Not Yours to Keep. I had mentioned that this all sort of got sparked by a strange photograph. And so it was for many years called Pocket Photo. And it's sort of, its purpose in the story changed many times, which meant that the title didn't exactly apply anymore. Not Yours to Keep was something that happened at the 11th hour, something that I just was rewriting a paragraph and it came up and I went, that's it. It really encompasses, and I can't say the word, it really hits on all of the struggles that all of the mothers in this story are going through. Are they birth parents? Are they adoptive parents? Are they foster parents? Are they kidnappers? I mean, do they have the right? Should they be should they keep the child? Is it theirs? Is it legal? All of these questions. So for me, it was the right aha moment.
Yeah. Would you say, so it is a novel, but obviously from what you're saying, that your content does address some different issues in the adoption process. What would you say might be like the main message or main messages that you explore in your work?
I think one of the biggest ones is the impact, the trickle down of a decision a mother makes into future generations. Mm-hmm. I think now, given where the space that our world is in right this minute, the reproductive rights, women's rights, getting that out, thinking about that, I think that it evokes some of those kinds of questions, but it also really brings up the question of, what does family mean? How do you define family? And, is there one set way? Should there be?
So some of what you brought up leads me to think about, some of what we're facing right now in our current political, but, sort of the legal realm, where, in dealing with reproductive rights. And a question that has come up in my mind and now has been sort of tickled again in light of this conversation is the question about what in many states and potentially in the country about an abortion ban, and what seems like it would be inevitable as a result of that would be many more children, many more babies in our world that are not, that would then be put up for adoption because they're not in a place where they can keep the child.
Yes. So it's an interesting fear. I think that a lot of people are considering what will happen. There's a fear that we're going to be sent back to the days when, a single pregnant woman has to hide herself. They get sent away in shame. Babies, the black baby market becomes big. It was the first thought I had when everything, was overturned. And I actually read an article, and I apologize, the author's name eludes me right now, but it was in the Atlantic last summer speaking to this. And at the time, they were not seeing any real changes. But in my personal, I cannot speak on politics and healthcare and all that. I'm not that well versed, but in my personal opinion, it's inevitable that there's going to be issues. I mean, we were fortunate that single parenthood and teen pregnancy and all that was being embraced. I don't know how that can continue. I think we're being sent in a very punitive direction. And then there's the school of thought where people are, this is great. There's going to be babies available. So it depends what side of the fence you're really looking at. It's not, for me, in the 1980s when I worked in adoption, we thought we were so progressive. To go back in the years, the frame of mind from before that, I think is just very heartbreaking.
Yeah. Was your experience in that field, did you ever have the experience of, we have more people who are seeking children than we have children needing homes?
Always. I, at that point, was working in domestic infant adoption. It was a very different story for older kids and foster kids. But I can't say that we had we were making adoptions, placing babies constantly. But it was, it was very grueling. When I worked in the field, we were on the cusp of private adoptions where nobody knew anything about anyone, and we locked it all up in a box. And the beginning of what they called designated adoptions, where couples through an attorney would find birth parents, and then they would come to the agency for the home studies and to go through the rest of the process legally. So, and now these days in those kinds of adoptions, everybody, I can't say every time, but frequently they all know each other and they somehow might stay in contact. They have the opportunity to stay in contact in some way. It's a very different world right now.
And this was, you mentioned the older kids. So I had asked about babies, but now it makes me want to ask about what your experience was with the older kids. Was that also true for kids who were older? That there were more families wanting kids than kids needing homes?
I think that's always been the case, in my opinion, for older kids. Like I said, the work I did in adoption was for babies. When I left that, I did work in foster care. Didn't happen often that one of our foster kids got placed in a permanent home. It's a very difficult situation. I think there's so much from the research that I've done, I could see that there's so much better understanding of these kids now and what their needs are. And what we didn't know how to give back then was the support. We were sort of like, okay, here's your place. We're going to place this child with you and let us know what you need.
Right. Yeah.
And then come to you with their needs. And we'd be like, well, you said you wanted to do this. Yeah. So but I still see statistics. There's still a great need for adopting older kids.
So just to make sure I understood that correctly, because when I first asked the question about the older kids, did you mean that there are more older kids who need homes than families willing to take them, or the other way around for older kids?
More kids. Way more kids.
Needing homes. So it's sort of like those who are up for adoption, it's almost like they age out of being in the favored spot. Is that?
Very much so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And so in your book, sort of coming back to that, and I'm sorry if I've diverged too far, but I'm so interested in this topic because I know so little about it. In your novel, sort of tell us a little bit more about, are we talking about babies? Are we talking about older kids? So a little bit more.
I focus primarily on domestic infant, which is domestic being we're in the United States. And it takes place in Massachusetts, which is where I had worked. So I was more familiar with the laws, and which sadly haven't changed that much yet. But yeah, so it is about that mindset of I have to have a baby.
Mm. And what kind of, oftentimes I know our listeners like to learn about what kind of research was, you might have engaged in the process. Were you more focused on the fiction of this story? How much research were you doing in terms of either the laws or, statistics or any of that?
I took what I knew from way back and then I compared it. So I would write, the law says you have 6 months to, and at 6 months, if the placement goes well, then they'll so I had to check facts like that. So I still had some of my old files where I had like my policies and the laws, the copies of the laws that I had. So I was able to pull up the new laws and I could see, I recognized everything. There's still so much that needs to be done in terms of acknowledging the rights of all players, in this. But so I did all that. I just had like weird experiences. Like it's one of those things where you start talking to people and you find out what their connection to adoption is. I got in a taxi cab and I wasn't even talking, and the driver started telling me his whole experience about being an adoptee. So like it's like little moments like that. People I know who have adopted or who have been adopted, sort of tying into their emotions that as they've expressed them to me. But I was very fortunate in the end that I had been introduced to these women who were adult adoptees. So they would have been placed a little earlier than the time that I worked, but it was all around the same feel. So it was fascinating experience to hear how I was doing then came, sort of impacted them and what's happening now. And I learned a lot now about the laws that they're fighting for still, but closer. And it was fascinating. It made me want to write another book about adoption. I don't know if I will all that soon, but there's just what's happening out there now is to me mind-blowing, and what hasn't happened, what's stagnant is just still also mind-blowing. And now and I'm going back to what we were saying, like with, reproductive rights and healthcare and all that being impacted. I don't know how much can change. All the work that they've put in to bring this forward and to the future and to really care for everybody in what they call the adoption triad. It's a tough moment.
Yeah. Let's take just a short pause and we'll come back and we'll talk more about the audiobook edition of Not Yours to Keep. Get your copy of the audiobook of Not Yours to Keep by Zelly Ruskin. Billy, an infertile adoption specialist, risks going down a dark path when she begins to long for her pregnant client's baby. Her husband, Tyler, is keeping secrets, and Anne, a woman haunted by childhood abuse, obsesses about the life she could have had. When a newborn goes missing, these characters' lives collide, and they must confront the complexities that define family or risk losing it all. Get your copy of the audiobook of Not Yours to Keep by Zelly Ruskin. Now available on Amplify Audiobooks. And we're back. So, Zelly, you had multiple points of view in your book. And so we went with the option to have different narrators record those different points of view. So your narrators, Jess Wright, Carrie Brewer, Jason Lasky. Tell us a little bit about, from your perspective as an author, about that decision to have multiple voices and then the casting process and what that felt like for you.
I think what we've discovered is that I love complicated. It was not easy in the best possible way. So my book is Billy is the main, well, there's three main characters. There's Billy, there's Anne, and there's Tyler. And so the decision to have, I loved the idea that each voice was going to come to you as their own voice. And so then you guys all sent me a huge amount of auditions that I had to sort through. And the hardest part is I think every one of them could have nailed it. And then what I learned about myself was that I get stuck on little tiny inflections that other people probably would never notice or ever hear. And so with it, but it was sort of helpful because then I could say, okay, this is this person's tick. Can I listen to that for 336 page hours? And so that sort of is how I started to narrow it down. And then I got to the point where I would just listen to each. I would close my eyes and who did I see when they were speaking? I mean, obviously Tyler could only be Tyler, but for the female voices, who's coming up for me, Anne or Billy? And so when I got to the very end of it and I had the ones that I could really see my characters and I felt like they really understood who these people were, I played them for myself consecutively, Billy and Tyler, to make sure that the tone of the story was going to mesh. And I really feel like with these three, my cast has such a great dynamic, and I'm so excited for them to bring this to life.
Yeah, they are three great narrators, so I'm excited for you as well. Yeah. And now, of course, at the time that this interview is going to land, your audiobook is going to be live. So just for our listeners, we are recording this prior, in part so that we can include a part of this interview as bonus material in the audiobook. But at this point, have you had a chance yet to listen to their recorded? You've done your review?
I had my first 15s.
Oh, okay, first 15s. Okay, great.
And very shortly we'll be getting the entirety.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
So it's a very cool experience.
Yeah. I love asking authors about this because, I've been in this industry for so long. So I think for our listeners, many of whom are authors trying to figure out the audiobook process, it's helpful to hear what it's like from the perspective of those who are kind of just in this for the first time ever. So at this point, which is sort of a little early in the process, but is there anything about it, the process so far of creating the audiobook that really stands out to you?
And besides the fact that I'm having a great time, I mean, it makes you really give a soul to your characters. I mean, I think I've written them dimensionally, but now I had to answer questions about who they are, what they would think, what they would look like, pick an actor or a movie that they might have been in. And you really have to dig so much deeper than you would for the written book. And it's great because I feel closer to my characters now.
That's awesome. That is great. Was there anything beyond that surprised you? Has surprised you so far?
What has surprised me? How quick and easy it is.
Oh, great. That's good. That's good. Terrific. And then I also like to ask about what your aspiration is with this book, audiobook, but then also, with you've mentioned ideas about other books that you are thinking about writing. What's your aspiration going forward?
Oh, I'm full of plot ideas. I absolutely love writing. I just get taken away when I'm in the midst of creating like that. And this is a new experience, this sharing, letting other people in on it. But for me, I want to keep doing it. I want to entertain people, but I want to throw in a little teachable moment when they're not looking. And if I can do that, I've met my goals. The audiobook for me is a very important part of it. I remember I was very little. And I mean, I don't think today's generation understands audiobooks have been around forever. Mm-hmm. My first one, and I may have mentioned this, my first one was Peter and the Wolf on a 45 record. Yeah. And I can still remember the feeling of sitting down and listening to it and getting taken away on that vacation in his world. I remember the music for the intro and in between chapters. And there are people, and I have people in my life too who are auditory perceivers. And, learning disabled people with brain injury, they need this. So I love that it's so easy a process to do and be able to get it to them so that they can, that it will come out when my book comes out and they can just have it and enjoy it like everybody else at the same time.
Yeah, that's great. And what would you love for your readers and listeners to take away from your book? Tell them about the impact you'd like to have.
Well, I think I said, enjoyment, that when you get into a good book and you're taken somewhere else. But I think beyond that, I would love it if somebody, even one person, thought about the issues in the book and came away with more understanding of the adoption world, more compassion for the people involved in it. That would be a hurrah for me.
Yeah, I think that is pretty much guaranteed, because it's clearly well written and well narrated. So, and then tell our listeners your website so they can learn more about you and your writing.
The website is zellyruskin.com. And the best way to get to know about me is to also sign up for my newsletter, which is called Sometimes Snarkastic, and which I think right there tells you all about me. And, if your listeners were to follow me on all social, I make it easy. I'm at Zelly Ruskin.
Great. And so our listeners know you can, if you haven't gotten the audiobook yet, you can do that at amplifyaudiobooks.com. Zelly Ruskin, author of Not Yours to Keep. Zelly, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I've really had a great time.
Good. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.